Most people think July is when the gardening season starts winding down. They stop planting, pull out tide plants, and wait for next spring. But that's one of the biggest mistakes a gardener can make. Because July isn't the end of the season. It's actually the beginning of your sweetest, easiest, and most rewarding harvests. In fact, many vegetables planted right now grow faster in the warm soil, face fewer pests, and become incredibly sweet after the first fall frost. Today, I'll show you 15 vegetables you should plant in July if you want fresh food all the way into autumn, and maybe even into winter. Some of these crops will completely change the way you think about late-season gardening, and number 8 is one every gardener wishes they had started sooner. So let's get started. Number 10, kale. The frost lover. Most gardeners think their leafy greens are done once the cold arrives, but kale is built the opposite way. This is one of the toughest plants you can grow, standing strong through freezes that would wipe out almost anything else in the bed. Put the seeds in from mid-July through mid-August, and the plant spend the coming weeks building thick roots and a full spread of leaves before the chill sets, and the real magic, though, is what happens once frost actually touches. The plant reacts by turning its stored starch into sugar, so a leaf that tasted rough and slightly sharp in summer comes out tender and almost sweet after a few cold nights. That is why so many people who tried kale once in July and hated it never bother trying it again in November, when it is actually good. You get options to pull baby leaves early for a soft salad green in about a month, or leave the plant standing and let the cold do its work before harvesting big mature leaves for cooking. Either way work. Varieties worth growing in the UK and Canada climate include dinosaur kale for deep flavor and curly types for milder everyday green. It handles cold snaps well into the low 20s, so there's very little risk in planting it late. Number 9, beets. The double harvest. Most people grow beets to the root and completely ignore the leafy top, which is a mistake, because those greens are just as good as spinach once cooked down, and you can pinch a few off while the root beneath keeps growing. Plant them in the middle of summer, and the warm ground gets the seedlings up fast, and as the nights cool toward autumn, the roots pack in sugar the same way carrots do. The tricky part is getting them to sprout at all in dry, warm soil. Because what looks like one beet seed is actually a small cluster wrapped in a hard shell that naturally resists sprouting until conditions are right. The trick gardeners across the UK and Canada swear by is soaking the seed overnight in water before sowing, which softens that shell and gets a much more even germination instead of a patchy row. Space the seedlings out once they come up so the roots have room to swell. And by autumn you are pulling sweet, dense beets that store well through the colder months. A reliable dark red variety is the standard choice, and it rarely lets you down. Number 8, carrots. The underground sugar factory. A carrot pulled after a real cold snap tastes nothing like the one sitting in a supermarket bag. The plant reacts to falling temperatures by pushing sugar down into the root as a kind of natural defense, and that is what gives a late-season carrot its almost dessert-like sweetness. Sowing in midsummer times a harvest perfectly with that cold snap. But carrot seed is stubborn. It is tiny, it sits shallow, and the top layer of soil needs to stay damp constantly for it to sprout, which is nearly impossible in a hot, dry summer. The fix passed down by generations of growers is to lay a thin layer of straw over the row right after sowing, which keeps the surface moist long enough for the seed to wake up. And once you see the first green shoots, you simply pull the straw back. Mixing the seed with a bit of sand before sowing also helps spread it evenly instead of clumping in one spot. Sweet, slender varieties work particularly well for this kind of planting, and once mature they can sit in the ground through fairly hard frost without any damage. Number 7, cabbage. The winter keeper cabbage shares that same cold equals sweet relationship that carrots and beets have, but it brings one extra advantage: it stores for months once harvested, which made it a genuine survival food long before anyone had a fridge. Planting in the heart of summer avoids the two disasters that ruin a cabbage grown in hot weather. The heads either split apart from swelling too fast, or the plant panics and shoots up a flower stalk instead of forming a proper head. Getting the transplants into the ground while it is still warm but heading up as the weather turns cool solves both problems at once. Pick a fast maturing type so the head closes up tight well before any serious freeze arrives, because a loose and finished head simply will not keep once you cut a solid head before a hard freeze. Store it cold and it will last you well into winter, whether that is fresh in stews or turned into a jar of homemade sauerkraut. This is not a vegetable you eat in a week, it is one you eat for months. Number 6, Brussels sprouts. The patience crop. This is the slowest plant on the entire list, needing well over 3 months to actually produce anything worthwhile, which is exactly why it has to go in the ground during summer. If you wait until it feels like proper autumn planting, whether you will end up with a tall stalk and nothing on it. These are big hungry plants that Need real space, full sun, and consistent watering because they are building sprouts along a thick stem for months without much visible reward until near the end. But here's why growers put up with the wait. Once real frost hits repeatedly, the plant converts its own starches into sugar as a kind of natural antifreeze, and that is the entire secret behind why a frosted sprout tastes nutty and mild while a sprout picked before any cold snap tastes bitter and cabbagey. They can sit through fairly harsh cold without damage, so there is no rush to harvest everything at once. You can leave them on the stalk and pick as needed, letting the weather keep improving the flavor the whole time. Number 5. Broccoli. The cool weather finish of broccoli flips the entire logic of this list because it actually dislikes heat. It is a cool season plant through and through, and the only reason you plant it during the warmer months is so it matures once the weather turns cold. Force it to head up during a heat wave, and you get loose stringy heads that taste bitter and bolt almost immediately. So the strategy here is counting backward from your expected first frost and starting the plants roughly 10 to 12 weeks before that date. There's a real obstacle, though. Broccoli seed often refuses to sprout in warm soil. The heat basically tells the seed to stay dormant, so most growers start it indoors somewhere cool and only move the young plants outside once they are established. One trick that stretches your harvest further than most people realize is choosing a sprouting type rather than a single head type, because after you cut the main head, it keeps sending out smaller tender side shoots for weeks afterward, turning one planting into an extended harvest instead of a single cutting. Number 4. Zucchini and summer squash. The comeback crop by the middle of summer. Most spring planted squash is usually already struggling, coated in white powdery mildew or hollowed out by a borer that tunnels straight through the stem and kills the plant almost overnight. Starting a fresh batch now means skipping past that first wave of pests entirely and getting clean, vigorous plants that start producing within about 2 months and keep going right up until frost catches at a second wave of mildew tend to show up later in the season as the air gets more humid, so the fix is simply giving the plants more breathing room than feels necessary. Wider spacing means better airflow and leaves that dry out fast after rain or dew, which keeps mildew from taking hold in the first place. Compact bush type works well if space is tight, while a classic yellow variety gives you the smooth, spineless texture people prefer at harvest. Either way, one healthy plant will produce far more than most households can eat. Number 3. Cucumbers. A clean restart. If your early cucumbers this year got chewed apart by beetles or collapsed from disease, a second planting now gives you a genuine reset because you are starting after the worst of that seasonal pest pressure has already passed through the growing area. These grow quickly to a compact type, handing you fruit in under 2 months. You can choose a bush variety if you are short on space, or send a vine up a trellis for straighter, cleaner fruit that is easier to spot. And pick the one thing that decides whether your cucumbers taste sweet or bitter is water, because the broad leaves lose moisture fast in the heat, and any stretch of dryness during fruiting shows up instantly as bitterness in the harvest. So deep, steady watering through hot stretches is really the only rule that matters here. Everything else about growing this crop is fairly forgiving. Number 2. Sweet corn. The tight deadline crop. This is the one with the least room for error on the entire list because there's only a narrow window early in the warm season to get a late batch established. Once the weather cools, sugar stops building in the kernels no matter how close the ears are to ready. So the whole approach depends on choosing a fast maturing variety that finishes in roughly 10 to 11 weeks rather than anything slower. One detail wrecks more late corn than any pest ever does, and that is planting in a single long thin row. Corn is pollinated entirely by wind, not insects, so a lone row just lets the pollen blow away before it can land where it needs to. The fix is planting in a tight block, several short rows side by side, so pollen from the tassels above is somewhere to fall no matter which direction the wind is blowing. That one change is a difference between full ears and ears full of gaps and missing kernels. Number 1. Beans. A rolling harvest crop. Beans earn the top spot because of one simple habit almost nobody uses to its full advantage. Instead of a single planting, you sow a fresh short row every week to 10 days, which keeps young tender pods coming steadily all the way to the first hard freeze rather than one overwhelming glut all at once. Beans actually prefer warm soil, so a summer sowing germinates faster and grows more vigorously than an early spring one. There is one adjustment that matters more than people expect, and that is planting the seed a bit deeper than usual because the very top layer of soil dries out fast in the heat while the moisture a few centimeters down stays consistent enough for the seed to sprout reliably. You can grow a climbing type up a trellis if you want vertical structure in the garden, or a bush type that needs almost no support at all and just keeps producing on its own. The only real limit is frost, which kills the plant outright with no warning, so the final sowing has to be timed carefully enough that the plant finishes well before the cold actually arrives. That is a full countdown 10 crops that turn the back half of the year into the most productive stretch of the entire garden. Instead of treating this time as a season winding down, think of it as the start of the sweetest, most reliable harvest still to come.